So our first presenter this morning is Meaghan Anderson. Meaghan is a field agronomist in central Iowa and an extension field specialist at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, where educational programming is available for farmers, agribusiness, pesticide applicators, certified crop advisors, as well as other individuals interested in crop production. Her areas of expertise include weed management, weed biology, cover crops, corn, and soybean management, as well as integrated pest management. So let's welcome Meaghan.
Thank you. Okay, let's grab this. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Oh, good. Okay, we're gonna have some hopefully conversation today, so don't fall asleep on me. My name's Meaghan Anderson, and I've been asked to present a little bit about winning against weeds. And I think that's an important topic. How was weed management in this area last year? So-so? I see a lot of like, it was okay. All right, what's your biggest weed problem? Water hemp? How many say water hemp's your biggest problem? Oh, good, because that's what I'm going to talk about. That was perfect. It's like I planned it. So just a little bit about myself, because I assume most of you don't know who I am. My name's Meaghan Anderson, and I am an extension field agronomist in central Iowa. I used to be in eastern Iowa over in this 8 area, and then I moved to central Iowa because it got me closer to my family farm. And I worked in Illinois for ever so brief a time for Monsanto when I was in school. And so I always thought that where I lived in Iowa was very flat until I went and started working in like Farmer City, Mahomet, and Champaign, Illinois. And then I learned that that was actually what flat looked like, and it was not where I lived. But I'm an Iowa State grad, and central Iowa got me closer to my family farm. And so I'm very vested in this weed management thing because it's a big problem for us. And so today I would like to talk a little bit about the fact that water hemp is developing herbicide resistance faster than we are developing herbicides. That's a big problem for management because we rely so heavily on those herbicides. We need to tailor herbicide programs better to manage our weeds, specifically water hemp for most of us, right? And for some people in individual fields, it may be a different species. And we could talk a little bit about that, right? But maybe in one field you have Pennsylvania smartweed, or in some other field there's ivy leaf morning glory or velvet leaf or something showing up, right? That we need to focus a little bit better on managing that species. But overall, most of us are trying to just simply do a better job of managing water hemp. So let's talk about that. And then finally, this is like the striped elephant in the back of every room every time I have this discussion, right? Is that we are not going to be very successful at managing water hemp unless we include other tactics aside from herbicides. And it's something that nobody wants to talk about, and we don't want to face the fact that it's coming, but it's like a freight train coming toward us right now. And so we have to talk about it, right? The farmers that are able to better adopt some of these non-chemical tactics are going to be successful in the end, right? The rest of us are going to be drowning in water hemp seed. So let's talk about herbicide resistance. Right, so I don't live or work in Illinois, but you are winners. Congratulations. That there are 7 herbicide groups that water hemp is known to be resistant to, and all 7 of those have been found in Illinois water hemp populations. And so that could mean one thing, which is that you have far worse water hemp issues and herbicide resistance issues than everybody else. But I suspect probably what it actually means is that you have really good weed scientists that are doing a better job of monitoring populations than we are in Iowa or in Minnesota or Indiana or wherever else. So you're the winner, but you're not alone. So Iowa does some herbicide resistance work as well. And so this was some work, just a quick little summary here, right, of some work that was done in both 2013 and 2019. 2013 is in red, 2019 is in yellow. And so this was originally done by Mike Owen and then followed up by a grad student in 2019, where basically they selected random GPS points across the state of Iowa, determined which ones were in soybean fields, drove to those soybean fields ahead of harvest, and if there was water hemp above the canopy, they collected the water hemp seed. right? And then they processed the water hemp seed and observed the resistances in those populations. And so not only did we have resistance to 5 different herbicide groups in Iowa, so they studied groups 2, 5, 9, 14, and 27, right? So that's like our ALS inhibitors, the pursuit type products. It's atrazine, it's glyphosate. They used lactofen or Cobra as their group 14 product, and then maybe mesotrione as the group 27. And so what we've seen over time is this original, we have multiple resistance. This is to the 1x rate, right? So you can see we had some populations of about 100 populations were only resistant to one of those 5 herbicide groups in 2013. A lot of them were resistant to 3 herbicide groups. And when you used a 4x rate of the herbicide, right, we were able to see that we got a little bit better control with some of those herbicides. But the problem is that our population is advancing very quickly. And so just 6 years later, that yellow bar represents how much of the same fields, right, going back to those same populations, are now resistant to multiple herbicide groups. So basically every population they studied was resistant to more than one herbicide. So water hemp is smart, right? We're not going to get rid of these herbicide resistances in these populations. They're just building up over time. And so now it's not 2-way resistant, now maybe it's 4-way resistant 6 years later. And that didn't take very long. And we didn't get any new herbicides in that time frame. And so something that they didn't do in this study is they didn't research resistance to glufosinate or the growth regulators. And so we know that Illinois has had growth regulator resistance, and glufosinate is one that has yet to be discovered in a water hemp population in this area. And so Iowa State took all those random populations as well as a number of farmer-submitted populations where they suspected they had some resistance, and they just tested them against a 1x rate of glufosinate, 2,4-D, and dicamba. What do you think they found? This is where you talk. It's very helpful. You think they killed them all? No, not even close, unfortunately. Right, and so we can't say that these populations are necessarily resistant, but what we can say is that we definitely have reduced susceptibility to 2,4-D, dicamba, and glufosinate in these populations that they looked at, right? So we had basically, I think, 17% survival of the plants that were treated with 2,4-D. There was about 5% survival from dicamba and 4% survival from Liberty, or glufosinate. And so that was kind of our first sign that this is obviously a problem, right? We know that this is happening. We get phone calls from farmers where those plants are not dying in the field to that 1x rate of the herbicide. And it's always like, well, could it be resistant, or could it be the weather conditions that we applied it in, or the carrier volume that you used, or the rate that you chose, whatever it may be, right? It's always very difficult to understand that. But this is kind of a more scientific way to really look at these populations. And then that led up perfectly to the fact that Bayer actually came to us this last summer in early September, and they told us that they had 2 populations in Iowa, and they refer to them as likely herbicide resistant. But I think given the fact that they had 2 years to study them, right, 2021 and 2022 is when these 2 populations were identified, I'm going to call them that they're basically resistant, right? If they came out with a press release about it, basically, and came to us, right? We don't think dicamba is going to kill those populations, and we know that those already exist elsewhere, right? It would be so silly to think that well, they only found 2. There's no more, right? We're doing okay. And so let's talk about water hemp management, because the herbicide options that we are going to have in the future are few and far between. Right, we're just checking them off the list, and this isn't a new thing that these herbicide resistances are occurring, right? So Iowa State monitored 2013 and 2019 populations, but we know that the growth regulators were already failing long before that. And we know that now we have group 15 resistance building in populations, and Liberty resistance, glufosinate resistance, was already discovered in a Palmer amaranth population in Arkansas in 2019 as well. What the heck are we gonna do? Grow corn? Walk fields, I like that. That's good. I hope you're building a labor force of children somewhere. I only have 2 kids. They're not going to be very helpful, I don't think. Not working on that very hard. Yeah, so there's a difference in where we're sitting now and a difference in where we're going to look in the future, right? Has anybody seen a field that looks like this? Absolutely, right? Has anybody seen fields that look like this? So what do you think weed management is going to look like in a decade in those 2 fields? How do you think they'll look in 10 years? I would almost be willing to bet that this field, right, that nice clean field, is still going to be clean. Because I imagine that the farmer farming in that field has prioritized weed management for a long time. I suspect that they have a very low seed input every year, and they have a much smaller seed bank of water hemp seed than this field over here, right? It's very difficult to dig yourself out of this kind of hole when we have weed management that's that bad. But it's not impossible. But it starts like today to fix that, right? We can't wait and sit on our hands and say, oh, you know, we'll deal with it next year. And that, unfortunately, is a lot of what I have been seeing in Iowa is that, Marty, no offense, but everybody's willing to spend $25 an acre, $30 an acre on a fungicide. But at that beginning of the season, when we're looking at those herbicide programs, they're like, oh, but how do we make it cost less? Like, just $5 less an acre would be great. Anybody get that sentiment out there? Right? Yeah, I get it too. And so it's not all about cost, right? It's about managing that program better. But the end goal for all of us needs to be this, right? Preventing weed seed from entering the seed bank is how we prevent new weeds. So how do we keep the seed from going back into the soil? And so there's a few pinch points in our system, in our production system, right? Those weeds all have to germinate and come out of the ground, right? Okay, well, maybe we can control them before they come out of the ground, right? In that germination process. They all have to produce seed, all these annual weeds. How do we keep them from producing seed? That seed has to drop from those plants. Can we keep the seed from dropping from the plants back into the soil so that we prevent this? And that is in a cornfield, and believe me, I've seen a lot worse weed control in corn in the last 2 to 3 years. And I'm getting nods, so that means you probably have as well. And you know what that means when we go back to soybean the next year? That means it's harder to kill the weeds in soybean. So Bob Hartzler did this really nice summary of this work from Wisconsin, and I'm going to talk about it because I think it's one of the best summaries of chemical weed control for water hemp that I've ever seen. 5 years of chemical weed control in water hemp and kind of what they learned. This is a great summary available on the Wisconsin Weeds. It's wiskweeds.info website. Rodrigo Worley did this. Yeah, Rodrigo is excellent. And so I just want to show you these to start with. So this is kind of grouped by the primary active ingredient in the mixture. So we've got metribuzin. These two have sulfentrazone. Right, sulfentrazone, that's those authority products that we're all pretty familiar with. And then these two have pyroxasulfone, which are the Zidua. And so the red graph is research work plots, the weed control in those plots when they use metribuzin, or sulfentrazone, or pyroxasulfone by themselves. And then the yellow is where they used premixes containing those products. And so like the metribuzin premix was Boundary, where it's metribuzin and dual. The sulfentrazone premix was Authority MTZ, which is sulfentrazone and metribuzin. And then the Zidua Pro is the premix for the pyroxasulfone with pyroxasulfone, Sharpen, and Pursuit. Which, are you gonna pick the red or the yellow? Which looks better? How many say red? Okay, good. Anybody say yellow? You like the yellow control? No, the red control, the red graph was better in every scenario looking at these active ingredients. Why? Anybody have thoughts?
Higher concentration of the active ingredient.
Higher concentration of the active ingredient. I have a ringer up in the front, of course, knows everything, right? Rate selection, generally speaking, right? Product is super important, but it's one thing to pick a really good product. It's another thing to make sure that that product is going to effectively manage your target weed. And so, for example, I'm going to look at this Spartan, which is the sulfentrazone, because that's a product that I have a ton of farmers that use. So they compared, in these research plots, lots of research plots, 8 ounces of Spartan or sulfentrazone, and they compared it to Authority MTZ, or we're comparing it to their plots that had Authority MTZ. And you could see here, those Authority MTZ plots had 4 to 5.8 ounces of Spartan versus 8 ounces. Right? In some cases, it had half of the rate that they had in those other plots. Do you think that's going to affect its ability to control water hemp? So what's the advantage of, oh wait, we'll hold off on that part. Okay, so the pre-rate is really important for pre-weed control. It's also important when you go back and you look at how well those plots performed after a post-application. So this graph is a little confusing, so I'm going to explain it right. So if you had excellent or greater than 90% control of water hemp with your pre, and you came back and you sprayed a post, this is the percent control you had 2 weeks after the post, right? So excellent weed control in the pre, or water hemp control in the pre, you had, maybe 95, 96% control of the water hemp after your post. If you had poor, bad control with the pre, less than 60% control, 2 weeks after the post, that post only got you up to maybe 78, 79% control. Why'd that happen? Those posts, they're so good at cleaning things up. I just want them all to emerge and then I'll just kill them all. We used to do that with glyphosate, right? Yeah. Oh, it was so satisfying to take down those really big plants. We're not there anymore. Our herbicides don't work that well, right? We use more contact products, Liberty especially, right? 2,4-D and dicamba. I can maybe take down a 6-inch weed, right? I'll maybe get marginal on the label, but I'm not taking down a 12, 18-inch weed with that. We're just not there anymore. And so the best control we're going to get is if we can keep things from emerging so you have far fewer plants there when you spray your post. And that's a really hard thing to get used to, right? Like pulling a sprayer into a field where you really can't see much for weeds in it and spraying the few plants that are out there is tough to do. It's very hard to do. But that's where we need to be because we need to prevent these things from producing seed. And so one of the ways, right, I think we're all pretty good about choosing the proper product, right, or choosing active ingredients, herbicides that are effective against water hemp. We've got that down pat. But I still think there's some work that we can do on rates to make these products more effective. Does anybody think about the herbicide rate real specifically when you're choosing your herbicides? A little bit? Okay, so I want to just show some examples. These are corn examples because I remember I said that management in corn makes a big difference for soybean. So this is Resicor. Does anybody use Resicor? We got a few people. 2.75 quarts. That was my full rate on the label for the soil type that I was looking at, right? Like I kind of pick a medium soil type, 1.5 to 3% organic matter. So usually on the high end of that, 2.5 to 3. Anybody familiar enough with your rate? Are you at 2.75 quarts with your Resicor? No? Shaking their head no. So remember, this is the full rate of the premix. And in many cases, we're not going out even with the full rate of the premix. And so in that full rate of the premix, to control water hemp, you're getting almost 2 pounds of acetochlor, or harness, and you're getting 0.2 of a pound of mesotrione or callisto. And how do I know what that rate means, that almost 2 pounds of acetochlor. Well, I go and I compare it to, well, if I applied harness by itself, how much acetochlor could I get in a full rate of harness? Still with me? Right, so I go look at a full rate of harness, and for the same soil type as the full rate of Resicor, and I could apply 2.41 pounds. So I'm getting, almost half a pound more acetochlor in the full rate. Right, I mean, the Resicor really has a pretty good rate of acetochlor as far as premixes go, but there's a little bit of room to work with, right? We're leaving maybe a half pound of acetochlor on the table somewhere that we could be using to control our water hemp better. And then 0.2 of a pound AI of the mesotrione. That's pretty close to the pre-full rate of the Callisto. Pretty good, right? That's a not bad, right? We got 2 herbicide active ingredients that are going to work against water hemp, or we hope will work against water hemp. We expect they will. Let's look at a couple other ones. So Harness Extra is another one. We're focusing in on acetochlor. 3 quarts of Harness Extra is going to get us 2.3 pounds of acetochlor versus the 2.41 pounds. That's pretty good, right? Just 1/10 of a pound left on the table. But what about Sure Start? Is anybody here using Sure Start? No. Did anybody use it in the last 5 years, right? Resicor is, of course, like the new Sure Start. And a lot of my farmers have moved on to that too, but I still hear about people using it. And so 3 pints is the full rate of Sure Start. We've got 1.4 pounds of acetochlor in that. Ouch. 60% of the full rate versus the 2.4 pounds. And the other 2 active ingredients in the Sure Start are not effective against water hemp, right? So you go out with Sure Start, you got to realize that even if you're at the full rate, you're getting 60% of a full rate of acetochlor, and that is the only thing in that premix that's doing any good against water hemp. So we got to analyze our herbicide programs a little bit. And this math thing, has anybody done this? Anybody doing this when you're planning programs? Maybe a little bit. Oh, there's somebody in the back who is. Thank you. Okay, so how do we do this? First of all, I have a resource for everyone up here that goes through examples of, if it's a dry product that's measured in ounces, if it's a liquid product in fluid ounces, or if it's a liquid product in pints or quarts or whatever. And so you are welcome to take those. They're very, very helpful. I made up an Excel document so I can do it fast, because I now get asked so often from farmers that I work with about this that I have to just be able to pull the Excel document up and say, okay, it's measured in pints, right? Here's how I do this. But there's 2 things on the label that you need to know. One of which is you need this early part of the label where right down here it says it contains 3.75 pounds of acetochlor, 0.38 pounds of clopyrrolid, and 0.12 pounds of flumetzylam active ingredient per gallon. So you need that information. And then you need the rate that you intend to use, right? And so for a product like Sure Start, maybe that's going to be the full rate. Maybe it's going to be something else. But when you compare it to the active ingredient by itself, right? So if I'm going to compare Sure Start to Harness, then you need to be looking at what the full rate is that you can apply for your soil types. And so then you just do a little bit of math. I know it's terrible. 3 pints per 1 acre times 128 fluid ounces has 8 pints in it, right? That's 48 fluid ounces per acre. And I cross the pints off to get fluid ounces per acre. And then the next one, I've got 48 fluid ounces per 1 acre now. And I'm going to multiply it by that concentration, which is 3.75 pounds of acetochlor per 128 fluid ounces. And that gets me to my 1.41 pounds of acetochlor per acre. Cross those off. Can everyone go home and do this now? Excellent. Let's talk a little bit more through it. So, pros and cons of premixes. Obviously, there's a reason that we use these, even if the rates are occasionally or often lower than they are in the individual AIs by themselves. So what are some pros? What are some reasons that you choose to use premixes?
Ease of life.
What?
Ease of life.
Ease of life, is that what you said? Yeah, right? Easy mixing, came in 1 jug, right? Pour it in pour it in the tank, right? Inductor cone, whatever. It's easy. What else? Is water hemp your only weed out in every field? No, right? So premixes offer some benefit in that you get a variety of herbicide products that are going to control a broader range of weed issues than a single AI will. Anything else? I think the ease is the big one, right? Like, you don't have to worry about mixing it yourself. You don't have to worry about whether these two products can be put together in the tank without causing some issue. You don't have to jar test, right? I don't know whether they're more cost effective, right?
Price would be a big one.
What?
I think price would be a big one. I think
Okay.
if I put programs together and I'm making my own premixes, a lot of times it's more expensive.
Okay, making the own premix is a lot of times more expensive. So let's talk about that, and I'm going to go through one example. I'm glad you brought that up. What are some cons of premixes? Any?
Lower rates, we just talked.
Yep, lower rates. Another one I would say is that sometimes you get products that you don't need, right? Like if you don't have a really broad spectrum of weed issues, large seeded broadleaves all the way to very small seeded broadleaves, right? Big seeded grasses like woolly cupgrass or something. Sometimes it does have products you don't need, right? That you're paying for that you don't necessarily need out there. And then the other thing that I would say is that I think to an extent, not always, but sometimes you pay for convenience. Right, so sometimes the cost of those could be more expensive than if you tried to put things together yourself. And so I think of this like I can go and I can buy Chex Mix mixed together, right? It's cheap food, right? I go to the gas station, buy a bag of Chex Mix, or I can make it myself. And I think there are some pros to making it myself. Because I like garlic and I like butter. And these things, they just never have enough seasoning for me. I don't know about you. They don't have enough seasoning for me. And then I love these little, the rye chip things. Those are real good. And there's like 10 of them in the whole bag. Every time I buy it, right? I buy it because I love it and then I regret it because it doesn't have what I want. And so I'm going to go through a little scenario. And this is one that I did just a few weeks ago with a farmer. And so I'm calling him Farmer A. His actual name is Keaton. I really hope he isn't watching this online. And he felt disappointing weed control in 2023. And so we went out, we looked at some of his fields, and this is like by far the worst spot. His weed control really was not that terrible, but he did have some areas in fields and just a few spots where the water hemp was a little bit out of control, and he had a little bit of velvet leaf in some of the fields, but not all of them. And so we talked about it. We went through what he did. He had a 3-way premix. It was a group 5, 14, 15. It was like the Cadillac of premixes, right? Those 3 herbicide groups are like the 3 that I would put together if I wanted to try to kill water hemp really well and effectively. And he used Enlist, glyphosate, and I believe he had some dual 2-Magnum in his post application. And so we talked a little bit about that, and something that he thought was, well, I kind of like that premix. I like the premix approach, but can I make it better? And so this is like the idea of you really like Chex Mix, right? It's pretty good stuff. But it doesn't have everything you want, right? Like maybe you like peanuts, or maybe you're like me and you really like those little rye chip things. So what he thought was, well, maybe I take my premix, or I take a premix and I look at how I can make it more effective, right? I can add to it to make it better. And so these are the 3 programs that he ended up looking at. And so just so you know, oh man, that yellow, it gets kind of washed out. It looks really nice and pale on here, and it looks like day-glow yellow on here. He last year had used 26 ounces of this product, Antares Complete. And so these are the 3 programs he's looking at this year, and these are the herbicide groups. And so one was he said, okay, I used 26 ounces of Antares Complete last year, and that just didn't totally cut it for me. I know I'm going to have to make a change. And so what he was looking at was, okay, do I use this same herbicide program and I add this blanket 4F, which is something that he could get from his local co-op, and that was just more sulfentrazone. Right, so the product had sulfentrazone in it, it had metribuzin, and then it had metolachlor or dual. And so he said, okay, I'm just going to use that same program, but I'm going to bump up my rate. I'm going to add like 7 ounces of blanket to get me to the full rate of sulfentrazone. Because what he didn't realize was in this 26 ounces of Antares Complete, when he did the math on that, that had about a quarter of the full rate of sulfentrazone, right? Like we're not even at 60% like we were at the acetochlor in the Sure Start. We're at like 25%. And so he said, okay, I'm going to bulk this up. So this program this year, this example, had 4 1/3 ounces of metribuzin, a pint of metolachlor, and 12 ounces of sulfentrazone. That's what he was comfortable with based on what the rate said. He knows he's going to come back in with more dual later, so he's not real worried about the fact that that's a pretty low rated dual. And he's on high pH soils, so he wanted to keep that metribuzin rate pretty low. Because unlike in Illinois, we have all these like finicky issues in Iowa where metribuzin will burn the heck out of our soybeans in high pH soils. So he wants to keep that rate pretty low. And then he wanted to compare it, so his co-op, one of their recommended programs was 1.5 pints of Fearsome TZ. And so that had 4.5 ounces, so tiny bit more metribuzin. And then instead of having sulfentrazone, it had flumioxazin or Valor. 1.5 ounces, that's about a half rate of the Valor. And it had 1.92 ounces of pyroxasulfone. That's close to a half rate of the Zidua, the pyroxasulfone. And then he said, okay, well, what if I go with the full rate of the Antares Complete, which is going to have about half of what I need for the sulfentrazone, and then I add more blanket 4F. So then he gets 6 2/3 ounces metribuzin, 1.5 pints of metolachlor, and 12 fluid ounces of sulfentrazone because he bumped that rate up, maxed it out. And then he looked at the cost, and this is something that I don't often get to do, right? Nobody ever tells me prices for things, and we got to do kind of a cool analysis. So I'm curious, right? Look at those programs. Which one do you think was the most expensive? Can I get like a 1, 2, or 3 going across from the left? So number 1 would be this 2.5 pints of Antares. 2 would be Fearsome TZ, and then 3 would be the lower rate of Antares with more blanket. Which one do you think was the most expensive? Somebody says 2. Someone says 3. Anybody else? Nobody else wants to guess even this. 1. Oh, we got some ones. Okay, what do you think was the cheapest one? Any thoughts? 1. All right, this is good. We've got no idea, do we? This is excellent. Okay, and I mean, honestly, I would have had no idea. And so this is just one example, right? It's not always going to be this scenario, but it's worth looking at. So his full rate of Antares with blanket 4F was $35.66 per acre. How's that compare to your pre-cost?
It's fine.
Same? Okay. All right. 1.5 pints of Fearsome TZ, $38.40 per acre. Right? For a half rate of flumioxazin and a half rate of Zidua? Dang. Okay. Now this program, the one he had last year, and some more sulfentrazone, $26.67 per acre. Now, I'm feeling pretty smart after he tells me this. That doesn't happen very often. But I was feeling pretty smart because he came to me with these 2 programs, and I said, well, why don't you just do what you did last year and add more sulfentrazone to that? Went and did the math. That looks pretty good. Right? He knows he's going to put dual in with his post anyway. So his dual, right, his dual rate's going to go up a little bit, but it's going to be the same as what he did last year. So he just saved himself basically $9 an acre by making his own mix. I don't know whether that's the case every time, right? I don't know whether this is going to be your scenario specifically, but it's something that I think is really worth looking into because I believe he's going to have far better weed control this year than he did last year, and he did it at basically a cost savings to comparing it to the premixes that he was thinking about using. And so if the cost alone isn't enough to do it, I think the control should be. And these are from Aaron Hager, so I'm very thankful to Aaron. your University of Illinois weed scientist for sharing these with me, that this rate of especially the group 15 products, right? We talked about those low rates that we see in the corn products sometimes. This is so important because you are starting to see resistance. And I'm sure we're seeing it in Iowa too, but we just haven't recognized it yet because we don't have a good weed scientist out on the ground actually doing this research work. But this is harness, resistant field versus resistant population versus sensitive population, dual 2 magnum, resistant versus susceptible, outlook, resistant, susceptible, Zidua, resistant, susceptible. One of those looks a lot better than the rest, right? The harness looks pretty good compared to the rest. But all of these are starting to fail, if not completely failing. And these are at the full rates of these products. And so when you look at these individual populations, again, this is from Aaron looking at 2 resistant populations compared to 2 susceptible populations. And this is dual 2 magnum at increasing rates all the way up to basically 2.5 pints, which is essentially the full rate that you can come up with. And you can see they have plants coming up here compared with this susceptible population where it takes a much lower rate to control them. And so imagine if instead of at the full rate, you are at a 50% rate. That residual on that product is going to not last you very long at all. And we are going to be letting a lot more water hemp through. And so that looks bad with the dual, but I think with the harness, it's equally as scary because while you can still control them at the full rate, or you get a longer period of control at the full rate, I should say, you are still losing control compared with these susceptible populations. See how many more of them are present at these low rates than in the susceptible population. And this is the reality of where we are right now, where we're getting resistance to these residual products. We are shortening the life of the residual, and it's hard to see it in the field. And we're not going to know it until it smacks us in the face. Any questions about that herbicide rate stuff?
I guess on my side, when you start throwing chemicals in together, I worry about compatibility. That's
Absolutely.
a major thing. So
Yeah.
I think that's one thing when we talk about premixes, it just, the ease of life comes in there, but also trying to throw a bunch of, and we haven't talked to adjuvants or other things that get thrown in the tank. This is just plain Jane product, so obviously it should work very well in these settings, but in reality, sometimes it doesn't work that smooth.
Absolutely. So for those online that didn't hear that, so the comment was about compatibility of mixing these different chemicals together. And that absolutely can be an issue. And that's why it's important to ask questions of the manufacturers, right? When you're thinking about mixing things together, it's important to do jar tests and make sure they're going to work, right? It's important to pay attention to all those, unfortunately, reading the label, right? Those finicky things on the label that tell you the order in which to mix things and how to do it properly. And yes, it can be a pretty big challenge. I think it's easier with the pre, right, when we're looking at these pre's than it is with our posts because the posts have such a high level of need for those extra adjuvants like the DRAs, right, and surfactants and, right, like the Enlist label's got, a DRA and it's got a MSO, like Corteva wants you to use MSO with it and things, right? So I think it's easier with the pre's, but it's important to do that testing. Okay, and so it's not just herbicides, just as you noted, right? There's a lot of other things going on. So I think with pre-emergence control, the big thing is the rates, right? Making sure that we're choosing products at appropriate rates to control our weeds. And then with post-emergence, I think the big thing that we miss a lot of times is the timing. right? We're sitting there, either we're waiting for more weeds to control or the weather's not quite right and we just missed the boat a little bit, right? We've got 6-inch weeds instead of 3-inch weeds. But there's a lot of other things going on, right? We want to make sure that if we're only using a pre-product that doesn't have burn down, that we have a pretty weed-free seed bed when we're starting. That's how we need to start our season. The timing of those is also important. Post-emergence, spray carrier volume. If you're at anything less than 15, I'm wondering what is going on, because 15 to 20 is where we need to be in pretty much every case right now. Making sure that we're using the right nozzles to choose, right? Getting good spray coverage, right? Making sure that if you are using Liberty, you're paying attention to the fact that the label says, right? I believe it's medium to coarse droplet size, right? Not those dicamba nozzles that we got free from Bayer that are producing ultra coarse droplet sizes. That is not doing us any favors as far as weed control goes, right? At least not with products that we don't need to be using it with. And then adjuvants, of course, right? Making sure that we are following the label to choose the proper surfactant to be included. If we need a DRA, use a DRA. Using AMS is hugely important, especially as we look toward the Liberty type products. But that's not it. That's not going to save us. I'm not here to be your savior telling you to use your herbicides better, right? We got to be able to preserve our herbicides and make sure they work well long into the future. So using a diversity of weed management tactics is imperative, absolutely necessary. Narrow row spacing, cover crops, crop rotation, tillage, right? The soil conservationists don't like when I say that, but we've got good technology, right? We can do these things in targeted ways, in a way that we couldn't do in the 80s when some of these things, right? When we were looking at using tillage initially, right? Are there other things that we can do to preserve herbicide efficacy? Is there anything that you're doing on your farm? Yes.
So we do a really good job of talking about what you spray, how much you spray, what stage you spray, how you spray. And the one thing, if you ask what else can we do that I know works, that no one wants to do, is what time of day you spray, which is actually a misnomer. The best time to spray when the plant is most open to business is overnight.
Interesting. So he said that we don't talk enough about what time of day we're spraying, and says that overnight is right when the plant's open for business. The challenge is that so many of our herbicides rely on active photosynthesis to be happening, right, to be really effective. And so that's where we say, you know, sunny day, warm conditions. For things like Liberty, right, glufosinate, that's a really big one, that's what the research says is beneficial to it. I'm not sure about other products. That's a good thought, though.
Is the research done overnight?
I don't know. That's a good question. I would have to look if they did research in evening conditions, right? Low light conditions. I'm certain they did research work. Researchers have done work in low light conditions. Yeah, I mean, I think time of day is super important. I think there's other things that we don't talk about very much, right? pH of the spray, temperature of the water, right? There's all kinds of things that are going to affect this. But herbicides aren't going to save us, so this is only going to get us so far. And this is where we need to think about these other tactics, right? And so something that I think a lot of people have been doing is researching cover crops. And they fit fairly well with soybeans. And I like to think that, I'm sure everyone in this room's like, oh, that's not going to work for me, right? Not going to work on my soils. And I'm in central Iowa, where we really love our tillage. And we have very flat, very wet soils. And so I understand. I'm with you. But I think if somebody has the will to make it work, they can make it work. And it can work really effectively. And we don't have to grow like this, right? Like, you don't have to have cereal rye as tall as me to get effective weed suppression out of that cereal rye. And so the goal, right, is kind of this 4,000, 4,500, 5,000 pounds per acre. A lot of research work has shown that like 4,000 or so pounds per acre is pretty good to get some substantial weed suppression out of. And so this is just some work that was done in Iowa where they looked at several herbicide programs, right? So this is no cover crop, prefix and Liberty Post, no cover crop, prefix and Liberty Post, no cover crop, Liberty Post. And so, oh, sorry, this is prefix and Liberty Post. This was the prefix as the pre and Liberty Post. And so comparing no cover crop to cover crop, and that's a pretty marginal herbicide program, right? If we're going to talk about herbicide programs, those are not great options. But what we do see is that we see a substantial difference in the number of water hemp just comparing this, like this one and this one, this one and this one, and then this one and that one, right? That cover crop is doing a good job no matter the herbicide program that we chose. Right? We can choose a better herbicide program to work with that cover crop, but the cover crop made a big difference, right? It essentially cut the number of water hemp that we're dealing with in basically every case in half. So think of that as like a kind of marginal pre-herbicide program, right? Like it's not going to solve a problem, right? It's not the answer, but it's an answer that can help. Controlling weed escapes prior to seed set is very important. Someone sort of jokingly said walking fields, but it's no joke, right? Especially if you're somebody who has pretty clean fields overall. Like, I would absolutely not want those few little water hemp that escape to go to seed. There's a guy that lives just, I don't know, probably like 6 miles from me. He's got a couple fields right on either side of a really well-traveled highway. And he's always the literal first person in the field, right? Like if I want to go find the first person to plant, it's this guy. And last summer, I drove by and he was out with a hoe because he's right on the highway and he has really clean fields. And if he can see the water hemp above the canopy, he's getting rid of them because everybody else notices it too going down the highway. He has just impeccably clean fields. And now I know exactly why. It's because he's going out and hoeing on like 90-degree days. Right, preventing seed from entering the seed banks, the only way to prevent resistant traits from spreading. Anybody seen this before? Right, the zappers. So we're going to go through a couple other tactics, right? We know tillage, right? We know cultivation. We know the row spacing. But the zapper, for example, is an additional weed cleanup, right? Maybe a more efficient way to clean up those weeds than going and walking, depending on how many you've got. And so this was some water hemp control work that was done at the University of Missouri by a grad student in Kevin Bradley's group. And you can see here that I chose only 3 of the growth stages that they looked at and looked at the percent control. And the red is 7 days after treatment and the yellow is 42 days after treatment. And so basically each of these, the 7 and 42 days, they were not significantly different from each other, but these were, right? So at R6, they got close to 100% weed control, right? Maybe 90% weed control, water hemp control. At that R6 time frame, it actually can help prevent basically mature seed from entering the seed soil or entering the soil in the seed bank. And it's to clean up, right? This isn't like a weed control tool. You're not using this in the absence of herbicides or anything, but it's an excellent way to clean up fields.
Do the weeds have to be above the canopy?
Do the weeds have to be above the canopy? Yes. That's why this is a cleanup tool. If the weeds are in the canopy, it's much harder to A, get contact with them, and B, avoid the soybeans, because if you contact the soybeans, believe me, if it causes 100% control on water hemp or almost 100% control, you are also affecting the soybeans. And so I think they saw, depending on the treatment, they did see like up to 15 or 20% yield loss, like when the water hemp were in that canopy and they were getting a lot of contact with it. So we can have problems with it. It's not perfect, but it's a good cleanup tool. We need to make sure we reduce the influx of weed seed into crop fields. And again, these are just uncomfortable things to talk about. People don't like this. Manage weeds in field edges. Do we do an okay job of that? Oh, I'm getting like a no, emphatic no. Okay. I mean, I think people try, right? I think the challenge is that like the time that you need to control the weeds in the field edges is when you want to kill the weeds in the field. And by the time you get back and pay special attention to those field edges, they're like 4 times too big off label, right? So focusing on those field edges to keep new things from coming in is important. Cleaning equipment between fields or harvesting fields that are the weediest last. Does anybody consider doing that? Do you harvest weedy fields last? Or avoid weedy areas in fields during harvest? So our combines are very effective seed spreaders, right? So this is an example of a chaff lining mechanism. So it's basically a big metal chute that's put at the bottom. You put a baffle in here so that all the chaff drops. And so if there's anybody who's no-till, this is a really great opportunity to try to manage your weeds better. It doesn't eliminate the seed from entering the seed bank, but you end up with a huge percentage of that weed seed right in this area. So first of all, that chaff helps suppress those weeds, and then it provides you a very specific area to control them, right? So if 90% of your weed seed comes up in one 30-inch spacing, right, every 30 feet or however wide your head is, that makes them a lot easier to manage, right? You use a lot less chemical to do that if you're willing to go to the work. Other things are the mills, right? Harvest weed seed control, right? So seed terminator, seed destructor. This is an example of what the ReadyCop looks like, right? So they're very high powered spinning mills that essentially throw the seed around and crush it before it exits the combine in the chaff. And so there's a few questions that people have about it, that type of technology, one of which is, well, are there even weed seed still on the plants at the time we combine? Right, the weed seed needs to be on the plants to go into the combine in order for us to kill them with these mills, and the answer is yes, they definitely are. So at the time of soybean harvest, especially when we're looking at late September, we could still have more than 3/4 of that seed on the plants. That's good news for technologies like this. That's bad news if you're not using technology like this, because you know every water hemp plant you go pull into that combine in a soybean field, that seed is coming back out the back, or a great majority of it is. And so one of the questions that we have is how much of that seed actually gets shattered on the head versus gets in the combine. And some research in Iowa says there's quite a bit of it that shatters, right? So 17% in 2021 and 9% in 2022. But that still means that you've got like 80 to 90% of the seed getting in the combine versus shattering off that head. And so after they go through a mill, this is what the variety of seeds can look like, right? We've got anything from totally crushed, obliterated, severely damaged, moderately damaged, and then there's a few that will make it out with no damage. But what does it mean for germination? Overall, 87% destruction of the seed that gets in the combine with the ReadyCop mill in Iowa. So in 2021 and then in 2022, you can see 2022, it was a lot weedier. So in the absence of the weed seed destructor, they had over 23,000 seeds that germinated that came out of the combine in their sample. And when that terminator was running, they only had 2,000, so they reduced it by essentially 90%. So technology, like herbicides won't save us, but maybe technology will. Or we hope it will, because if it doesn't, then we're in big trouble. And so I'm just repeating what I said already, right? Water hemp is developing resistance faster than we develop new herbicides. We have got to tailor these weed management programs better to manage water hemp, right? And that includes paying closer attention to what herbicides we're putting out on the field. But it has to include some type of other technology, or we're just gonna be on this like herbicide treadmill and the weed issues are just gonna keep getting worse. So I think I have just a little time for questions. If anybody has any questions or any tomatoes to throw, perhaps anything.
I had an anonymous question from the audience.
An anonymous question from the audience. This should be good.
No, just a comment. So I know some of the example products that you talked about in corn and talked about pushing higher rates. Is safety an issue with some of those products that carry over in corn?
Next question, please. So one of the question, to repeat, was about higher rates for some of these products and whether or not safety could be an issue in corn or carryover. Absolutely, there are always concerns, right? Some products more than others, right? Most of the products that we use in season for the crop, if it's a labeled rate for your soil type, it's going to be pretty darn safe, right? There are scenarios, and that's where you want to talk with an agronomist, because there are scenarios where somebody local may be able to say, look, yeah, this is the highest rate, but this is probably the safest highest rate for you, right? Like my farmer A, he had 12 ounces of sulfentrazone, and we talked about that for a long time because 12 ounces is higher than I usually recommend 10 as the full rate for our soil types. And so we talked through the risk and the benefit of that and why he might want to be one way versus another. Carryover is always a potential problem. I think very rarely is a concern for carryover a reason to change your herbicide program plan. Because we have to kill water hemp. Like, that's period. End of sentence. And carryover is a risk. But if you're using rates that are appropriate for your soil type, carryover is often going to be a fluke. And it's generally going to be in places like overlap areas or areas that are already under extremely high stress. So, I mean, like, in my area, we've had a lot more carryover in recent years. But we have a lot of people trying to do one pass posts in corn, like end of May, which looks a lot different than using some of these products as a pre in the middle of April, right? And so timing of product application, following those labels for rotation restrictions, all that's really important.
But as we're trying to implement cover crops into our systems earlier and earlier, to put that, that grain down and that cover, these carryovers are huge. And to get to some of the rates that we're talking about that we believe we need for weed suppression and not letting that germinate, I think that's kind of what she was getting at, or what we're getting at here.
Yeah, so carryover to go to cover crops is also
such a fine line.
Yeah, yes, and it's absolutely a fine line and something to be concerned with. I think it's fairly low risk for, like if you're going for weed suppression, you're going to look at something like a cereal rye, and that is one of the most tolerant options that we have for most of these herbicide products anyway. I think the person who's going to be much more likely to run into issues with the cover crop is going to be, A, if you are in a severe drought, in which case I'm not certain you'd be able to germinate it very well in the fall anyway, or B, if you're trying to go out with some like 9-way mix, right? In which case then your goal isn't necessarily weed suppression. You're looking for some other type of goal. And maybe you want to tailor your herbicide program a little bit differently. There are probably some ways that we could pick products, individual active ingredients within these herbicide groups that are going to have different residuals. But I don't know that there's a lot of research work to say, yeah, we're going to be super successful with a 9-way mix or however many species anyway. And so, right, I have that like one-track mind of where can I get my biggest bang for my buck with a cover crop, and at least in my geography, it's not going to be with like some huge mix unless I have cattle or something, in which case then I'm violating these labels anyway. It's going to be trying to get weed suppression or trying to get feed value in the spring in the form of growing something big and harvesting it before I plant, or just growing it big so that I can suppress weeds. Okay, I'm looking around. Any other questions?
There's somewhere to find like herbicide compatibility charts?
Ooh, is there somewhere to find herbicide compatibility charts? I'm looking around. Does anybody know? I'm not aware of any specific herbicide compatibility charts. No, I am a big fan of getting somebody else to test it for you and tell you. Yeah, jar tests are great. Yeah, jar tests are an excellent way to get an idea of what is going to work together and relying on others' experience, right? If you go in and you say, hey, I want to spike my premix this spring in soybeans with more sulfentrazone, odds are pretty good that you show up at the co-op and you're not the first person who had that idea, right? They've got somebody else who's already done that. There's tons of people doing things like that. And so odds are pretty good that you can rely on some other people's experience too to know if it'll work. But I do know that, like, even, I don't know if you've had this issue, but we've had issues sometimes with product quality differing, especially during the pandemic, right? Where one year something worked well and the next year it didn't work as well. Not necessarily with premixing herbicides together, but with mixing different things in. I'm not going to get any more specific than that because I'm being broadcast, but we can talk about that if you want. Yes.
So a pre-emerge herbicide's life is based on temperature and moisture, how long it's going to be effective control. As we move to planting beans early and putting a pre on middle of April, we're running out of that residual.
Next question. Sorry.
Germinates.
Yeah.
Hager has done some work on it too. That was ISA.
Yes. So the pre-emergence herbicides are going to be dictated by the half-life, the longevity of the product. That's just a chemically different between different products. Temperature, moisture, right? How fast things break down. And planting earlier, it presents a huge weed management challenge. And I really don't think we've done enough work looking at this yet. I think that there needs to be a lot more work looking at what is the effectiveness of this pre look like, especially against water hemp, which we know won't emerge typically until late April, early May at the earliest often, when we are trying to put these pre's out on 5th of April, 10th of April, whatever it is, right, when we get our soybeans planted, because we are planting them so early. And that's all the more reason to make sure that when we're going out there, we're not going out with cut rates to start with. But the timing of it is going to be a huge issue in getting effectiveness of control. So it's this whole balance of, like, are we actually going to get earlier canopy to help add suppression of these weeds so that we don't need those herbicides to work for as long? Because 30 days to do your post after your pre looks a lot different if your post is on May 10th than if your post is on, May 28th or something, right? Like, that's a big difference in application timing. I wish I had, like, an answer. 3-pass system, that's your answer. Nobody wants to hear that either. Yeah, except for people selling product. There you go. Okay. All right, have I used up all my time? I think I did.
Yeah, you're good. You're perfect.
Okay. Thank you all for having me. I'll stick around for a while if you want to chat. I appreciate it.